The evening sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as Maria Reyes locked up the corner store where she worked her first job of the day. Her shoulders ached from stocking shelves for 8 hours straight, but she couldn't afford to rest yet. In 45 minutes, she would start her second shift waiting tables at Rosita's Cafe. As she walked quickly toward the bus stop, her fingers tapped an invisible melody against her worn jeans, a habit she couldn't break whenever music filled her head. At 18, Maria carried responsibilities far beyond her years. 3 years ago, her father had walked out, leaving her mother to raise Maria and her 2 younger brothers alone. Their small 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city was modest but clean, though the rent increased every year while their income struggled to keep pace. Music doesn't put food on the table, her mother often reminded her, not unkindly but with the practical wisdom of someone who knew life's harsh realities. Yet despite working nearly 60 hours a week between her 2 jobs, Maria still found time for what truly made her heart sing. The Community Arts Center had been her sanctuary since she was 12. An old converted warehouse with peeling paint and mismatched furniture. It wasn't much to look at. But inside those walls, Maria had discovered a world beyond her neighborhood's limited horizons. It was there she first touched a piano key, amazed at how a simple press could create such beautiful sounds. "You're late today," called Mr. Chen, the elderly volunteer who taught basic piano lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays. His smile was warm as Maria rushed through the door, out of breath from running the last 2 blocks after her bus had been delayed. "Sorry," she gasped, dropping her backpack beside the upright piano in the corner. "The store got a big delivery right before closing." Mr. Chen nodded understandingly. He had been teaching music for over 40 years and had seen countless students come and go. But few had shown Maria's natural talent and determination. 15 minutes is better than nothing, he said, patting the bench beside him. Maria sat down, her tired body suddenly feeling lighter as her fingers hovered over the keys. This old piano, with its slightly out-of-tune middle C and sticky E-flat key, was the closest thing to magic she had ever known. For the next quarter hour, the rest of the world faded away. No worries about next month's rent, no anxiety about her brother's asthma medication costs, no exhaustion from working double shifts. There was only music, beautiful, honest, and completely free. As they finished, Mr. Chen watched her with thoughtful eyes. "You know, Maria, you could apply for music programs at the state college. Scholarships are available for students with your level of talent." Maria's smile dimmed slightly. They'd had this conversation before. "Maybe someday," she said, gathering her things. "Right now, my family needs me." The truth was, even with scholarships, college seemed as distant as the moon. Between application fees, books, transportation, and the income her family would lose if she cut back her working hours, it simply wasn't possible. Not now, maybe not ever. Walking through the main activity room, Maria waved to the younger kids working on art projects. 10-year-old Luis gave her a gap-toothed grin as he proudly held up his painting. 7-year-old Rosie was carefully stringing beads for a bracelet. These children and dozens more found safety and purpose at the center, while their parents worked long hours. Near the entrance, a group of adults huddled in serious conversation. Maria recognized Mrs. Diaz, the center's director, her normally cheerful face creased with worry. "Everything okay?" Maria asked, pausing by the door. Mrs. Diaz forced a smile. "Just budget concerns, dear. Nothing for you to worry about." But later that evening, while clearing tables at the cafe, Maria overheard 2 regular customers discussing the center. "Heard they're shutting it down next month," said one man, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Property taxes went up again and the grant money dried up." "Shame," his companion replied. "My nephew learned to play guitar there. Keeps him out of trouble." Maria nearly dropped her tray. The center closing? The thought was unbearable. For many kids in the neighborhood, including her brothers, it was the only safe place to go after school. For Maria, it was her lifeline to a passion that made her hardships bearable. That night, despite her exhaustion, she couldn't sleep. The center had given her so much, it was time to give something back. An idea began forming, tentative at first, then growing stronger as the night progressed. The next day, after her morning shift, Maria marched into Mrs. Diaz's tiny office without an appointment. "We should hold a fundraiser," she announced without preamble. "A big one. With music and food and art from the kids. Show everyone what this place means to the community." Mrs. Diaz looked up, surprised by Maria's intensity. Honey, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but organizing something like that takes time and money. Things we're short on right now. I'll organize it, Maria insisted. I know it's a long shot, but we have to try something, please. Perhaps it was the determination blazing in Maria's eyes, or perhaps Mrs. Diaz was simply out of other options, but after a long moment she nodded. All right, but you'll need help. Over the next 3 weeks, Maria threw herself into planning with the same dedication she brought to everything in her life. She convinced the cafe owner to donate food. Local businesses, touched by her passion, provided small items for a raffle. Fellow students from her old high school volunteered to help with setup and serving. Between shifts at work, Maria created simple invitations and distributed them throughout the neighborhood and to local businesses. She even boldly walked into the offices of several companies downtown, requesting donations or attendance from executives who might have the means to help. Most ignored her or offered polite rejections. A few gave small donations. One secretary, touched by Maria's story, promised to share the invitation with her boss, a wealthy investor known for occasional philanthropic gestures. Don't get your hopes up, sweetheart, she warned kindly. Mr. Whitford rarely attends these community events. But I'll try, Maria nodded gratefully. At this point, she would take any possibility, no matter how small. As the event approached, challenges multiplied. The rental company doubled their quote for tables and chairs at the last minute. Their volunteer pianist, a retired music teacher from the local high school, called to cancel due to illness. 2 days before the fundraiser, a pipe burst in the center's bathroom, requiring emergency repairs that further strained their non-existent budget. The night before the event, Maria sat alone at the center's piano, playing softly in the dim light. Her mother had already called twice asking when she would be home. Her brothers had gone to bed without seeing her for the 3rd night that week. Her manager at the cafe had warned her that any more missed shifts would cost her the job. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was she foolish to believe she could save this place? Who was she? A teenage girl with no connections, no wealth, no real power, to think she could make a difference. Her fingers found a melancholy tune, one she had composed during late nights when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy. The music filled the empty room, speaking the fears she couldn't voice aloud. That's beautiful, came a soft voice from the doorway. Mrs. Diaz stood there, her eyes kind. Did you write that? Maria nodded, embarrassed to be caught in this moment of vulnerability. Mrs. Diaz came to sit beside her on the bench. You know, when I was about your age, I thought I was going to be a famous artist. Life had other plans. She smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. But I've never regretted the path I took building this place, helping children find their gifts. She placed her weathered hand over Maria's. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already done something remarkable. You've reminded everyone, including me, why this place matters. Maria took a deep breath, feeling some of her anxiety ease. I just want to do something that makes a difference. You already are, Mrs. Diaz assured her. Now go home and get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a big day. As Maria walked home under the stars, a new determination replaced her earlier doubts. Maybe they wouldn't raise all the money they needed. Maybe the center's future remained uncertain. But for one night, she would create a space where music and art could shine, where her community could come together and remember what was worth fighting for. She couldn't know that across town. In a penthouse apartment, a young millionaire named Thomas Whitford was absently flipping through his mail, pausing at a handwritten invitation his secretary had insisted he read. She couldn't know that his fingers, like hers, unconsciously tapped out rhythms when he was deep in thought. She couldn't know that his impulsive decision to attend some community center fundraiser would change the course of both their lives. For now, Maria simply quickened her steps, eager to get home and prepare for tomorrow. The future, with all its unknowns, could wait. Tonight, for the first time in weeks, she would sleep soundly, knowing she had done everything possible to save the place that had saved her. Thomas Whitford stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, gazing at the city lights spread before him like fallen stars. In one hand, he held a crystal glass of 30-year-old scotch. In the other, the handwritten invitation his secretary had insisted he look at. His reflection stared back at him. Tailored suit, perfectly trimmed hair, the casual confidence that came from never having to wonder if you belonged somewhere. At 26, Thomas had everything most people spent their lives chasing. The Whitford name opened doors before he even knocked. His personal investment portfolio had doubled in value since he'd taken control of his trust fund at 21. Magazines regularly featured him in their 30 under 30 lists, praising his business acumen and philanthropic potential. And yet, something was missing. He couldn't name it, this hollow feeling that sometimes woke him in the middle of the night. His therapist called it purpose deficit, a common affliction among those born into extreme privilege. Thomas called it a nuisance. He set down his glass and read the invitation again. The paper was cheap, the printing clearly done on a budget copier. But the handwriting that had added his name had a certain elegant determination to it. A community arts center, he muttered. What does Jennifer think I'd get from this? His phone buzzed with a text from his PR advisor. Don't forget about tomorrow. Small appearance, big impact for company. Image. Right. That's why Jennifer had pushed for this. Another photo op to soften the Whitford technology image after those factory automation layoffs last quarter. Thomas tossed the invitation onto his glass coffee table and walked to the baby grand piano that dominated one corner of his living room. His fingers trailed across the polished surface. How long had it been since he'd actually played? Months at least. As a child, he'd shown remarkable talent, his instructors all agreeing he could have pursued a professional career if he'd wanted. But the Whitford heir had more important responsibilities than chasing artistic dreams. His father had made that abundantly clear. Almost without thinking, Thomas sat at the bench and lifted the cover. His fingers found the keys from muscle memory, and the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the apartment. He closed his eyes, letting himself get lost in the music. For a few precious minutes, he wasn't Thomas Whitford, heir and executive. He was just a man playing a piano because it moved something in his soul. The ringing of his phone shattered the moment. His father's name flashed on the screen. Thomas, the older Whitford's voice was crisp. Just got off a call with the board. They're concerned about the Watson deal. No hello, no how are you, just business. Standard operating procedure. I've got it under control, Thomas replied, automatically straightening his posture even though his father couldn't see him. Their CFO is dragging his feet, but I'll have the contracts finalized by next week. Make it happen sooner. And don't forget the Palmer dinner on Friday. Senator Howard will be there. Good opportunity to discuss the regulatory committee. The call ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Thomas staring at his phone. 26 years old, running his own division of the company, and his father still treated him like an employee who might slip up at any moment. His gaze drifted back to the piano, but the spell was broken. He closed the cover and returned to his scotch. Morning arrived with Thomas's personal assistant, Blake, efficiently managing the day's schedule from the moment Thomas stepped out of his bedroom. Your 9 a.m. with development has been pushed to 10. Legal sent over the Watson contracts for review. Your trainer will be here at 6 instead of 7. And Jennifer wants to confirm you're still attending that community event this evening. Blake didn't look up from his tablet as he rattled off the information. Thomas poured himself an espresso from his imported machine. Can't we reschedule that last one? Send a donation instead? Blake finally looked up, his expression carefully neutral. Jennifer was quite insistent. Something about countering the out-of-touch narrative that's been building since the layoffs. Just a quick appearance, handshakes, photo op, then out. 1 hour max, Thomas sighed. Fine. Have the car ready at 6:30. He could spare an hour for the sake of the company image. Besides, these community events were all the same. Well-meaning but dull, with people either too intimidated to speak to him or too eager to pitch their business ideas. The day passed in a blur of meetings and calls. Thomas moved through them on autopilot, making decisions worth millions without breaking a sweat. This was the world he'd been groomed for since childhood. The corporate battlefield was where Whitfords were meant to thrive. As evening approached, Thomas found himself in the back of his luxury sedan, scrolling through emails while his driver navigated through unfamiliar neighborhoods. The buildings grew shabbier, the streets narrower. He glanced up occasionally, noting the contrast to his usual surroundings with academic detachment rather than judgment. We're nearly there, sir, his driver announced. Thomas slipped his phone into his pocket and adjusted his tie. He had chosen to dress down slightly for this event. No three-piece suit, just slacks and a blazer over an open-collared shirt. Jennifer had advised it would make him seem more approachable. The community center was a far cry from the gleaming venues where Thomas typically made appearances. The converted warehouse had been decorated with colorful banners and string lights, a valiant effort to transform the utilitarian space into something festive. A hand-painted sign welcomed visitors to the Save Our Center fundraiser. As Thomas stepped out of the car, he instructed his driver, "Wait here. I won't be long." Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Children's artwork lined the walls. Folding tables covered in donated food and raffle items formed a U-shape around the room's perimeter. In one corner, a small stage had been set up with a microphone and an upright piano that had seen better days. People turned to stare as Thomas entered, whispers following in his wake. He was used to the attention, had been dealing with it his entire life. He pasted on his public smile, warm enough to seem genuine, reserved enough to maintain distance. Jennifer materialized at his side, looking relieved. "You made it. Perfect timing. Mrs. Diaz is about to make the opening remarks. She's the director," she added, guiding him toward a stocky woman with silver-streaked hair. "Mr. Whitford." Mrs. Diaz's handshake was firm, her eyes appraising. "Thank you for coming. Your presence here means more than you know." Thomas gave her his practiced response. The Whitford family believes in supporting community initiatives. "Well, we're grateful. Please enjoy the event. There's food, a small art auction with pieces created by our students, and music performances scheduled throughout the evening." As Mrs. Diaz moved toward the stage, Thomas noticed a group of teenagers watching him with undisguised curiosity. One boy nudged another and whispered something that made them both laugh. Thomas looked away, scanning the room for the quickest route to make his obligatory rounds before leaving. His gaze landed on the piano in the corner. Despite its worn appearance, someone had clearly tried to make it presentable for tonight. The wood polished to a soft glow under the string lights. Without meaning to, Thomas found himself drifting toward it. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing down, feeling the smooth ivory beneath his fingertips. This piano had been loved, had brought music to countless people despite its imperfections. His own piano at home, for all its perfect tuning and flawless craftsmanship, had become little more than expensive furniture. "It's seen better days, but it still has a good sound," said a voice beside him. Thomas turned to find a young woman watching him. Unlike others in the room, she didn't seem intimidated or starstruck by his presence. There was something in her eyes, a quiet determination that seemed familiar somehow. "Do you play?" she asked when he didn't respond. "I used to," Thomas admitted, "a long time ago." She nodded as if this confirmed something for her. Sometimes it's hard to find time for the things that matter. Before Thomas could reply, commotion near the stage drew their attention. Mrs. Diaz was speaking urgently into her phone, her expression growing more distressed by the second. The young woman excused herself and hurried over. Thomas watched as they spoke, the young woman's shoulders slumping briefly before straightening with renewed resolve. She looked back at Thomas for a moment, something calculating in her gaze, then turned to whisper to Mrs. Diaz. Both women glanced his way, and Thomas had the sudden, uncomfortable feeling that his quick photo opportunity was about to become something more complicated. He should leave now, before whatever crisis they were dealing with could entangle him. He had done his duty by showing up. Blake was probably already fielding messages about the Watson deal. The driver was waiting. Yet Thomas remained rooted in place as the young woman began walking back toward him, purpose in every step. Something about her reminded him of himself at a younger age, before corporate responsibilities had calcified around his life like amber. As she approached, Thomas realized with sudden clarity what he'd seen in her eyes. It was the same look he sometimes caught in his mirror on rare moments when he allowed himself to want something beyond the path laid out for him. It was possibility. It was hope. "Mr. Whitford," she said, "I have a rather unusual request." Maria's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the young millionaire. She had recognized Thomas Whitford immediately when he walked through the door. His face had been on the cover of business magazines, and occasionally in the society pages her mother liked to flip through during her rare moments of rest. What Maria hadn't expected was to find him standing by their old piano, his fingers hovering over the keys with what looked like longing. Now, With their evening's entertainment canceled and dozens of expectant faces waiting for the music portion of their fundraiser to begin, Maria had made a split-second decision that either brilliant or completely foolish. "Mr. Whitford," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "I have a rather unusual request." His eyebrows lifted slightly, but his expression remained polite if distant. "And you are?" "Maria Reyes. I help organize programs here." She glanced toward the stage where Mrs. Diaz was trying to calm a group of anxious volunteers. "Our pianist just called. His car broke down on the highway and he won't make it tonight." Thomas nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. "That's unfortunate, but I don't see—" "I saw you at the piano earlier," Maria continued, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "The way you touch the keys? You play, don't you?" "Well, obviously you do, but I mean you really play." A small crease appeared between his brows. "I used to." "It's been a while." Maria took a deep breath. This was it. The moment to either retreat into safer territory or take a leap of faith. The entire fundraiser hinged on tonight being special, memorable enough that people would open their wallets and their hearts to save this place. They needed something extraordinary. "Would you consider playing for us tonight?" The question hung in the air between them. "Our program depends on this fundraiser. The children who come here, this center is all some of them have." Thomas stared at her with an unreadable expression. Around them, the room had grown quieter as people noticed their conversation. From the corner of her eye, Maria could see Jennifer, whom she recognized as Thomas's assistant, moving toward them with alarm written across her face. "Mr. Whitford doesn't perform," Jennifer said as she reached them, her professional smile strained at the edges. "Perhaps a donation would be more appropriate." "We could arrange—" "It's all right, Jennifer," Thomas said, his eyes still on Maria. Something shifted in his gaze, a curiosity perhaps, or a challenge accepted. "How long would I need to play?" Maria couldn't believe he was actually considering it. 20 minutes? Maybe half an hour? Just a few pieces to accompany our student showcase. The kids have worked so hard on their performances. Jennifer looked as if she might object again, but Thomas silenced her with a subtle gesture. "What kind of music were you expecting?" "The program lists classical pieces, Chopin, Debussy, some Bach. But honestly, anything would be wonderful. Most of these families have never heard live classical piano before." Thomas glanced around the room, taking in the modest decorations, the hopeful faces, the children peeking from behind their parents' legs. For a moment, Maria thought she saw something like recognition in his eyes, as if he were seeing beyond the surface to the heart of what this place meant. Then his professional mask slipped back into place. "I haven't practiced in months." "Don't expect perfection." Maria's face broke into a wide smile. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll tell Mrs. Diaz right away." As she hurried back to the stage, Maria could scarcely believe what had just happened. Thomas Whitford, whose time was reportedly billed at thousands of dollars per hour for consulting, had agreed to play piano at their little fundraiser. It was a miracle, or madness. She wasn't sure which. Mrs. Diaz's eyes widened when Maria whispered the news. "Are you serious? Thomas Whitford is going to play for us?" He said yes. "I can't believe it either." Mrs. Diaz squeezed her hand. "You never cease to amaze me, Maria. Let's make this announcement before he changes his mind." The older woman stepped up to the microphone, tapping it twice to get everyone's attention. The feedback echoed through the room, causing several people to wince. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight change to our program tonight," Mrs. Diaz announced, her voice warm with barely contained excitement. "Unfortunately, Mr. Gonzalez couldn't join us as planned. But we are incredibly honored that Mr. Thomas Whitford has graciously agreed to accompany our student showcase on piano." A murmur swept through the crowd as heads turned toward Thomas, who stood motionless by the piano. Maria couldn't read his expression from this distance, but she noticed his hand had returned to the piano surface, fingers drumming lightly as if already playing. Mrs. Diaz continued, "As many of you know, the arts program here at the center has touched hundreds of young lives over the years. Tonight, some of our students will share what they've learned, from dance to poetry to visual art. With Mr. Whitford's accompaniment, I know this will be an evening to remember." As the crowd applauded, Maria noticed Thomas removing his expensive watch and slipping it into his pocket. He shrugged off his blazer and handed it to a flustered Jennifer before rolling up his sleeves. The simple actions transformed him. making him seem suddenly more human, less the untouchable millionaire and more a man preparing to work. Maria hurried to his side. "The program order is on the piano. The first piece should be for Lily's ballet. She's 7 and has been practicing for weeks." "It's Claire de Lune, is that okay?" Thomas nodded, already scanning the handwritten program. "I know it well enough. The others too." He looked up at her. "You organized all this yourself?" Maria shrugged, uncomfortable with the direct question. "I had help. Everyone pitched in. But it was your idea. It wasn't a question. The center was going to close. I couldn't just let that happen." Something changed in Thomas's expression. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or respect. Before he could respond, Mrs. Diaz was gesturing for Maria to help bring the first performers to the stage. The next few minutes passed in a blur as Maria guided little Lily to her position. The girl's homemade tutu sparkled with glitter glue, her hair pulled back in a careful bun that her mother had spent an hour perfecting. Her eyes were wide with nervousness as she took in the crowd. "You'll be wonderful," Maria whispered, straightening the little girl's cardigan. "Just like we practiced." "But Mr. Gonzalez always counts to 3 before starting," Lily whispered back, anxiety making her voice tremble. Maria glanced at Thomas, who had seated himself at the piano. Would he know how to work with a child performer? Would he have the patience for her nervous starts and stops? "Mr. Whitford," Maria said quietly, "Lily is a bit nervous. Would you mind counting to 3 before you begin playing? It's her signal to get ready." To her surprise, Thomas's expression softened as he looked at the little girl in her handmade costume. "Of course." He leaned slightly toward Lily. "I get nervous before performing too. Would you like to take a deep breath with me before we start?" Lily nodded solemnly. "Okay then." Big breath in. Thomas demonstrated and Lily mimicked him. "And out." "Very good. Now you're ready. I'll count to 3, nice and clear." Maria stepped back, watching this unexpected interaction with amazement. The crowd had gone quiet. The small moment between the wealthy businessman and the little girl in a glitter glue tutu, capturing everyone's attention. Thomas positioned his hands over the keys. 1, 2, 3. The first notes of Claire de Lune filled the room, delicate and perfect. Lily began her simple dance, her earlier nervousness forgotten as the music carried her. Maria held her breath, watching as Thomas played with his eyes half closed, his fingers finding each note with precision and feeling that spoke of years of practice. Regardless of how long it had been since he'd last performed, the audience was completely silent, transfixed by the unexpected beauty of the moment. Parents who had been chatting in the back of the room drifted closer. Children stopped fidgeting. Even the volunteers paused in their tasks, drawn by the music and the sight of little Lily dancing her heart out to the accompaniment of a world-class pianist. As the piece ended, there was a moment of perfect stillness before the room erupted in applause. Lily curtsied deeply, her face flushed with pride. Thomas nodded acknowledgement to the crowd, but his eyes sought out Maria's. When he found her, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod that somehow conveyed both, "That wasn't terrible," and "What's next?" For the first time since learning about the center's financial troubles, Maria felt a spark of real hope. The evening was already becoming something special, something people would remember and talk about. Thomas Whitford's unexpected participation had transformed their modest fundraiser into an event as she guided the next group of children toward the stage. 3 10-year-olds who would recite poetry. They had written. Maria caught Mrs. Diaz's eye across the room. The older woman smiled and mouthed a silent, "Thank you." The evening stretched before them, full of possibility. Maria didn't know why Thomas had agreed to her outlandish request or how much money they would raise tonight. She didn't know if it would be enough to save the center. But in this moment, watching the wealthy young man connect with their community through music, she allowed herself to believe that sometimes the most unexpected bridges could be built between worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. The room fell silent as Thomas's fingers danced across the piano keys, bringing to life a Bach piece that accompanied the poetry recital of 3 nervous children. Maria watched from the side of the makeshift stage, hardly believing what she was witnessing. The young millionaire played with a skill that went far beyond someone who used to play. His technique was flawless, but more surprising was the emotion he brought to each note. As the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. Thomas Whitford, who had arrived planning a brief appearance and quick exit, seemed to forget about time entirely. The stiffness in his shoulders gradually melted away. The polite, distant smile was replaced by moments of genuine concentration and even flashes of pleasure when a young performer executed their part particularly well. Jennifer, his assistant, checked her watch repeatedly, sending increasingly concerned glances toward her boss. At one point, Maria overheard her whisper, "The Watson call is in 40 minutes. We need to leave soon." Thomas gave a slight shake of his head without missing a note. "Reschedule it," he murmured during a quieter passage. Jennifer's eyes widened in shock. In the 3 years she had worked for Thomas Whitford, he had never voluntarily rescheduled a business call, especially not for something as unimportant as a community center fundraiser. After the third performance, Thomas surprised everyone by addressing the audience. "These children are remarkably talented," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Their dedication deserves proper accompaniment." He turned to Mrs. Diaz. "With your permission, I'd like to play a solo piece before the next performer." Mrs. Diaz, looking slightly dazed, nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, Mr. Whitford, whatever you'd like." Thomas turned back to the piano, closed his eyes for a moment, then began to play Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. The piece started gently, almost tentatively, before building into cascading emotions that seemed to fill every corner of the modest room. Maria found herself holding her breath. She had heard recordings of this piece before, but never performed live, and certainly not with such intensity. Thomas played as if he had forgotten where he was, or perhaps as if he had just remembered something long buried. Around the room, people stood transfixed. Mr. Chen, Maria's piano teacher, watched with tears in his eyes. Parents who had been checking their phones now gave their complete attention to the music. Even the youngest children sensed something special was happening and listened quietly. For nearly 9 minutes, Thomas played without sheet music, without hesitation, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the piece. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room erupted in applause. Thomas looked up, seeming almost surprised to find himself surrounded by people. For a brief moment, his face showed naked emotion, a vulnerability that made him look younger, more human than the polished businessman who had walked in earlier. As the clapping continued, Mrs. Diaz leaned toward Maria and whispered, "I had no idea he was this good. He could have been a concert pianist." Maria nodded, equally amazed. "I wonder why he didn't pursue it." The applause finally died down as the next student performer, a 13-year-old boy named Carlos, took his position. He was scheduled to sing Amazing Grace with piano accompaniment. Thomas consulted briefly with Carlos, asking about his key preference and tempo. The boy, clearly starstruck, could barely form words but managed to convey what he needed. As Thomas played the introduction, Carlos took a deep breath and began to sing. His voice was beautiful, clear and strong, but halfway through the first verse, nerves got the better of him. His voice cracked and he faltered, looking panicked. Thomas smoothly repeated the phrase, giving the boy a chance to recover, but Carlos had gone completely silent, his face flushed with embarrassment. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Parents exchanged sympathetic glances. Carlos looked like he might bolt from the stage at any second. Without thinking, Maria stepped forward and began to sing, picking up where Carlos had left off. Her voice blended with the piano, creating a bridge for the boy to find his way back. After a few surprised seconds, Carlos joined her, their voices harmonizing. Thomas glanced up, momentarily startled by Maria's clear, confident voice. Something flickered across his face, surprise followed by appreciation. He adjusted his playing subtly to complement her tone, building a musical foundation for both singers. By the final verse, Carlos had regained his confidence, and Maria stepped back, allowing him to finish alone. The audience burst into enthusiastic applause, as much for the recovery as for the performance itself. As Carlos took his bow, beaming with relief and pride, Maria caught Thomas watching her with undisguised curiosity. "You never mentioned you could sing," he said quietly as she passed the piano. Maria shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Everyone here wears multiple hats. I help wherever I'm needed." That was more than helping. "You have a gift." Before she could respond, Mrs. Diaz was announcing the final performance, a dance number by the center's teenage group. As Thomas began playing the lively piece, Maria slipped away to help with the raffle setup at the back of the room. Throughout the rest of the scheduled program, Thomas continued to play, no longer checking the time or glancing toward the exit. Occasionally his eyes would find Maria in the crowd, a question in his gaze that she couldn't quite decipher. When the last performance ended, the crowd gave a standing ovation that was meant as much for Thomas as for the students. Mrs. Diaz took the microphone, visibly moved. "This has been a truly special evening," she said. "Before we move to our raffle drawing and art auction, I want to thank Mr. Thomas Whitford for his extraordinary contribution to our event." The applause redoubled. Thomas acknowledged it with a nod, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention now that he was no longer playing. "And now," Mrs. Diaz continued, "we have a surprise addition to our program. Maria Reyes, who organized this entire event, has agreed to perform for us." Maria's head snapped up in shock. This was not part of the plan. She had never discussed performing herself. She shot Mrs. Diaz a panicked look, but the older woman merely smiled encouragingly. "Maria is too modest to admit it," Mrs. Diaz said to the crowd, "but she has one of the most beautiful voices I've ever heard. For years, she has helped others shine while keeping her own light hidden. Tonight, we get to see that light." The crowd turned expectantly toward Maria, who felt frozen in place. Singing a few lines to help Carlos was one thing. Performing solo in front of everyone, including Thomas Whitford, was entirely different. Mrs. Diaz gestured her toward the stage. "Just one song, dear. For the center." Taking a deep breath, Maria walked slowly to the front of the room. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. She had never performed formally, had never had the opportunity for proper training despite Mr. Chen's insistence on her talent. Thomas watched her approach, his expression unreadable. "What would you like to sing?" he asked quietly. Maria's mind went blank. Then, almost without thinking, she said, "Do you know Bridge Over Troubled Water?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I do." His fingers found the opening chords, gentle and inviting. Closing her eyes, Maria let the music wash over her for a moment. Then she began to sing. Her voice, hesitant at first, grew stronger with each phrase. She sang about silver girls and sailing on, about laying herself down like a bridge over troubled water. The simple poetry of the lyrics seemed to speak directly to their situation, this unlikely bridge between worlds that had formed tonight, the troubles facing the center, the strength found in community. Halfway through the song, Thomas began to harmonize vocally while continuing to play, his rich baritone blending perfectly with her clear soprano. Maria's eyes flew open in surprise, meeting his across the piano. He nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. Together, their voices filled the room, creating something neither could have achieved alone. In that moment, the distinctions between them, rich and poor, privileged and struggling, seemed to dissolve, leaving only the music and the connection it created. As the final notes faded, there was a beat of perfect silence. Then the room erupted, people rising to their feet with tears in their eyes and wonder on their faces. Mrs. Diaz was openly crying. Jennifer stood slack-jawed by the wall, her scheduling concerns apparently forgotten. Maria and Thomas remained locked in each other's gaze for a moment longer, both slightly stunned by what had just happened. Then they turned to acknowledge the applause, Thomas standing from the piano bench to join Maria in a bow. "Thank you," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I haven't felt music like that in years." "Thank you for playing," she replied, still breathless from the performance and the overwhelming response. He shook his head slightly. "I came here thinking I was doing you a favor. I was wrong." Before Maria could ask what he meant, Mrs. Diaz returned to the microphone, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Ladies and gentlemen, the night is just beginning. Please visit our art auction tables, where every piece was created by our students. And don't forget to buy raffle tickets. We have wonderful prizes donated by local businesses." As the crowd dispersed throughout the room, many people approached Maria and Thomas, offering congratulations and thanks. Through it all, Thomas remained by the piano, no longer checking the time or looking for an exit. Something had shifted, in him, in the room, in the very air between them. The fundraiser continued, now charged with an energy and excitement that hadn't been there before. And Maria dared to hope that this unexpected bridge between worlds might be strong enough to save everything she cared about. As the fundraiser drew to a close near midnight, Maria stood by the entrance, saying goodbye to the last few families. Her feet ached from hours of standing, and her voice was slightly hoarse from talking and singing, but her heart was fuller than it had been in months. The evening had surpassed everyone's expectations. The art auction had sold every piece, many going for 3 or 4 times the modest asking prices. The raffle tickets had sold out completely, with many people buying multiple sheets. Several attendees had written checks directly to the center, inspired by the performances they had witnessed. Most surprising of all, Thomas Whitford had stayed until the very end. After their impromptu duet, he had mingled with the crowd, listening to stories about the center's impact with genuine interest. He had bid generously on artwork created by the youngest children, now carefully wrapped and being loaded into his car by his driver. He had even helped the volunteers stack chairs when the formal part of the evening concluded. "We did it," Mrs. Diaz said, joining Maria at the door. Her eyes were tired but shining with happiness. "Early count shows we raised enough to cover 6 months of operating costs. 6 months to find more permanent funding." Maria hugged her tightly. "I can't believe it worked." "You should believe it. This was your vision, your determination." Mrs. Diaz pulled back to look at her. "You have a gift, Maria. Not just your voice, though that's extraordinary. You have a way of bringing people together, of seeing possibilities where others see obstacles." Before Maria could respond, Thomas approached them, his sleeves still rolled up, his tie long since removed and tucked into his pocket. He looked different than he had when he arrived, more relaxed, more present. "Mrs. Diaz," he said, "I've been thinking about your after-school music program. Jennifer tells me you've been trying to expand it but haven't had the resources." Mrs. Diaz nodded cautiously. "We have a waiting list of children who want to participate, but we can only afford 1 part-time instructor." Thomas glanced at Maria, then back to Mrs. Diaz. "I'd like to discuss establishing a proper music education fund for the center, not just for 6 months but long-term." Mrs. Diaz's mouth fell open slightly. "Mr. Whitford, that's incredibly generous, but it's not charity," Thomas interrupted, a hint of his businesslike tone returning. "It's an investment in talent. I've seen firsthand tonight what this center does for these kids." His expression softened, and what it's done for at least one remarkable young woman. Maria felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "Could we meet next week to discuss details?" Thomas continued. "I have some ideas about structuring it as a matching grant to encourage community involvement." "Of course," Mrs. Diaz managed, looking slightly dazed. "Any time that works for you." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Jennifer will set it up." He turned to Maria. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Curious and a little nervous, Maria followed Thomas to the piano. The room was mostly empty now, just a few volunteers finishing the cleanup. "You have an exceptional voice," he said without preamble. "Have you had any formal training?" Maria shook her head. "Just what Mr. Chen could teach me alongside piano lessons. Professional training isn't really in my budget. Would you want it? If money weren't an issue?" Maria hesitated. It was a dream she rarely allowed herself to consider. "My family depends on my income. I can't just drop everything to chase a dream, no matter how much I might want to." Thomas studied her for a moment. "What if there were a way to do both? The Westbrook Conservatory has an excellent work-study program. Students receive full scholarships and stipends in exchange for teaching community classes." Maria's breath caught. The Westbrook Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. That's impossible. Their acceptance rate is tiny, and application deadlines for this year passed months ago. "The Dean of Admissions sits on the Whitford Foundation Board," Thomas said simply. "They make exceptions for exceptional talent." Maria stared at him, trying to process his words. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." "I know enough," Thomas replied. His usual polished confidence had given way to something more authentic. "I know you organized this entire event to save a place that matters to your community. I know you stepped up when that boy froze on stage, putting his dignity above your comfort. I know you have a gift that deserves to be developed." He paused. "And I know what it's like to set aside a passion because of family expectations." The last admission hung in the air between them, unexpectedly personal. "Is that why you stopped playing?" "Family expectations?" Maria asked quietly. Thomas gazed at the piano keys, a faraway look in his eyes. My father made it clear that Whitfords are business leaders, not musicians. I made my choice a long time ago. But you could have been amazing. You're amazing. A small smile touched his lips. Thank you. But tonight wasn't about me. It was about this place, these kids. He looked directly at her, and maybe about remembering why music matters in the first place. Maria considered his offer, all its implications and possibilities. I would need to discuss it with my mother, and I'd still need to work part-time to help with my brother's expenses. Of course, Thomas nodded. The program is designed for students with responsibilities. Think about it. Talk to your family. The opportunity will be there when you're ready. As they walked toward the exit, Maria noticed Thomas's assistant watching them with poorly concealed curiosity. Your assistant probably thinks I'm trying to take advantage of you, Maria said quietly. Thomas laughed, a genuine sound she hadn't heard from him before. Jennifer is just surprised. I don't usually reschedule business calls or spend entire evenings at community events or offer scholarships to people I've just met. His expression grew more serious. But I don't usually feel like myself either. Tonight was different. Different good, different necessary, he replied. 5 years later, Maria stood in the wings of Cooper Hall, peering out at the filling auditorium. Her debut recital as a graduate of the Westbrook Conservatory had sold out weeks ago, partly due to the buzz around her recent award-winning performances, partly due to the prominence of the Whitford Arts Initiative that was sponsoring the event. Nervous? Asked a familiar voice behind her. Maria turned to find Thomas watching her with a smile. In the years since their first meeting, his face had softened somewhat, the constant tension of corporate life giving way to a more balanced existence. Though still involved in Whitford technology, he had gradually shifted much of his focus to the foundation, particularly its arts programs. Terrified, Maria admitted, but the good kind of terrified. Like standing on the edge of something wonderful. Thomas nodded in understanding. Your family arrived. They're in the front row. Your brothers are arguing over who gets to keep the program as a souvenir. Maria laughed. Her youngest brother was now studying computer science on a Whitford scholarship, while her middle brother had discovered a talent for sound engineering through the expanded programs at the community center. Her mother sat on the center's board of directors, bringing her practical wisdom to its governance. Did you ever imagine that night at the fundraiser, that we'd end up here? Maria asked. Thomas considered the question. Not specifically this, no, but I knew my life had changed course somehow. He straightened her concert program on a nearby table. I'd forgotten what it felt like to play music that moved people, to use my privilege for something meaningful, and I'd never dared to imagine that my voice could take me beyond my neighborhood. Maria smoothed her concert gown, simple but elegant, a far cry from the second-hand clothes she'd worn to that fateful fundraiser. We changed each other's lives. You changed mine first, Thomas said quietly. I walked into that center thinking I was doing a good deed, making an appearance for the sake of public relations. Instead, I found my way back to the person I might have been. The 5-minute call came from the stage manager. Thomas reached for Maria's hand, giving it a supportive squeeze. Ready to show the world what Maria Reyes can do? Maria took a deep breath. Ready to show them what happens when people from different worlds build bridges instead of walls. As she walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause, Maria caught sight of Mrs. Diaz sitting beside Thomas's parents in the third row. The older woman gave her an encouraging nod. In the years since the fundraiser, the center had not merely survived but thrived, expanding its programs to serve hundreds more children and families. The Whitford Arts Initiative now supported similar centers in 5 other neighborhoods with plans for more. Maria took her position at center stage, where a gleaming grand piano waited. Though her primary studies had been in voice, she had continued developing her piano skills as well. Tonight's program would showcase both, including a duet with a special guest. As the applause died down, Maria settled her nerves and began to play, not a classical piece but the same song she and Thomas had performed that night at the fundraiser. Bridge Over Troubled Water filled the concert hall, her fingers finding the same notes that had changed the course of her life. When she began to sing, her voice, now trained but still authentic, carried all the emotion of her journey. At the second verse, Thomas walked onto stage to join her, just as he had 5 years ago. Though he had largely returned to music as a patron rather than a performer, He made an exception for special occasions like this one. Their voices blended just as perfectly as they had that first night, but with a depth and understanding that only time and shared purpose can build. As they sang about laying themselves down like bridges over troubled water, the words held new meaning, a testament to the ways their unlikely connection had created pathways for not just themselves, but for hundreds of others. When the final note faded, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. But for Maria and Thomas, the greatest applause was silent, the knowledge that sometimes one unexpected request can truly change everything.